Welcome to the Ryan Research Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Ryan. I'm joined by Eric Helleiner, the author of The Neomercantilists, A Global Intellectual History. How you doing, Eric?
Great, thanks for having me.
Can you give a quick summary of what your book's about?
I can try. So the book is essentially arguing that there's a whole tradition of economic thought, which I call Neomercantilism, going back to the kind of late 18th century, which has not received the kind of historical overview that other major traditions in the late 18th, 19th, early 20th century have, like Marxism or economic liberalism. And if you were, an economic thinker in the 19th century, this is one of the three big pillars of thinking about, especially about the international economy. And so this book is trying to say, hey, let's give a little more attention to these people, not because I'm an advocate, I should emphasize right away, of neo-mercantilism, but just because it's a really influential way of thinking about international economic relations. It's not free trading, and it's not kind of anti-capitalist as the Marxists were, or the liberals being in the free trade camp. It's an in-between position, which is essentially saying we think you should be part of an open world economy, but you shouldn't do it on the basis of free trade principles. You should be activist, have an activist state, especially kind of strategic protectionist policies that might promote local industry in a way that makes you more competitive in global markets. And this, it's all kinds of dominant thinkers in the 19th century have this view. They're not liberals, they're not Marxists, they're neo-mercantilists. And I think it's interesting historically, but I have to admit, was driven to write the book because I think we're back in a kind of a neo-mercantilist era right now with, thinkers, kind of backlash towards free trade, some of whom are not neo-mercantilists, like these are people who just don't like free trade in general, but many of whom are neo-mercantilists in the sense they're not against an open world economy. They just think their state needs to be doing activist, protectionist policies to cultivate industry. And it might be, the latest high-tech sectors or all kinds of reasons why you might want to promote your local industry. But what is at the core, I should emphasize, of neo-mercantilist thought is that you're trying to build the power and wealth of your state. And so that's the kind of goal. And you just don't think free trade is going to do that. You think you need to have a kind of activist state to do that.
All right. And can you talk more about your specific biography and how that biography and your past work kind of led into this work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've been interested in the history of economic thought, especially economic thought about the world economy, for a long time, and especially interested in economic nationalist thought and the way in which that's been depicted over time. And so this project kind of emerges out of that, but I have to admit it's also this is a subcategory, really, of a broader project, and a book is coming out in April, which is kind of attempting to provide a background for anyone who wants to know how people thought about the world economy before 1945, before the end of World War II. And so I began writing that, and easy to write the chapters on free trade thought, easy to write the chapters on Marxist thought, but I was really struck by, I had no sources that provided a comprehensive history of neo-mercantilist thought. And so this was kind of, I couldn't write the book that's coming out next year without first writing this one and showing, look, there's this huge tradition we need to recognize.
Yeah. And you started to talk about, this idea of there's free trade, there's Marxism. So we have these like two tent poles, these columns that we kind of go back and forth between, and there's this spectrum in the middle. But neo-mercantilism kind of represents this third way of thought. So what do you think that there is a dialectic between free trade and Marxism, and why is neo-mercantilism left out of that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that, because I spent 3 or 4 years writing this book, and I kept thinking, why has nobody written this book before me? Mm-hmm. And I began to think, I think at least one reason is the Cold War, which encouraged kind of a binary sense, debates in political economy were between capitalism and communism and their legacies through the liberal tradition or the Marxist tradition. And I think it really squeezed out, people who were in this third tradition and you see it with specific figures like Raul Prebisch, for example, was a major kind of advocate of import substitution industrialization in Latin America in the 50s and 60s. And people, some liberals say, oh, he's kind of a Marxist, which he wasn't. He was like a central banker from Argentina, a fairly conservative figure. And the Marxists think, oh, he's just a capitalist, and yet he's this third position. And I think there's many figures of that kind during the Cold War who are being forced, people are saying it's a binary debate. Where are you? And they're not. They're like in some third position, which is this neo-mercantilist tradition. But I think I think that's one of the reasons the history wasn't written earlier. And then I think there's one other reason, which is when the Cold War ends, there's such a kind of triumphalism around a free market and free trade thought that the idea of writing history of protectionism just seemed like, why would you do that? It's kind of anachronistic. Nobody believes that stuff anymore. And so I think that's maybe part of the other reason. And it reflects in my own economic history. I became interested in writing this because of the resurgence of neo-mercantilism in China and Trump in the United States and other parts of the world. And so history is always driven by contemporary concerns. And I think that's one reason I've written this book. And I think it's the reason why it wasn't written earlier.
How do you think within that 19th century, which is this sort of maelstrom of ideologies forming, how do you think neo-mercantilism fared there? Maybe not as always fully formed, but as Marxism was developing itself, especially in the later half of the 19th century, was neo-mercantilism perhaps more popular back contemporaneously when these major thinkers were developing the ideas? Vis-a-vis Marxism or free trade?
Yeah, so it's an incredibly influential ideology, and not just in some parts of the world, but in many, many parts of the world. And so I don't know if you want me to get into examples, but major developments in the world economy were driven by neo-mercantilist thought, like the German turn to protectionism in 1879, for example, which is really decisive a moment in the world economy, or American trade policy throughout the 19th century, is largely protectionist and driven by neo-mercantilist thinkers. And I was giving a talk about this a while ago, and someone said to me, in a way, it was the more popular. Like it was the free traders who are always having to justify their, in some ways, odd view, whereas the more natural position is, yeah, we should protect our industry and back it up in international competition. And so it's a dominant and very influential ideology around the world.
Yeah, and if there ever was sort of a back foot that the neo-mercantilists in their heyday were on, it's probably on this sort of prefix neo. What was it about the mercantilist that made the neo-mercantilists have to add the neo?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because essentially, Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations in 1776 is really, that book is a critique of what he calls mercantilism. He invents the idea that there is something called a mercantile system that he's then attacking with his ideas of freer trade and freer markets. And because of the influence of Adam Smith, a lot of people after that book don't want to be called mercantilists. And so there are some people in the book that I write, are proud to describe themselves as neo-mercantilists, but many of them are not. And they have other labels for what they are. And I've given them the neo-mercantilist label essentially to say these are people who were aware of Smith's work, aware of the power of Smith's critique, because Smith had some very important arguments against this earlier tradition of European thought that he was attacking. But they still, they said Smith had made some good points, but he still didn't convince me fully that free trade is right. And so that's a neo-mercantilist, is someone who's taken on board Smith's critique of classical mercantilism, but is then saying, but it's still valid. There's still certain things about the need to pursue power and wealth and to do it with activist policies. Those are the things that they retain. But you've really hit on an important point, that they're on the defensive intellectually often, especially in more formal scholarly circles, where especially political economy circles, where the liberal tradition is very dominant.
And what do you think of angst that maybe fueled some of these reactions to Smith from the neo-mercantilist? I think probably Friedrich List, the German economist in the 19th century, he was probably the most animated, let's say, attacking Smith and having almost more sort of political rhetoric and attacking Smith as sort of that was a vehicle of somewhat propaganda, versus maybe someone like Carey was a little bit more diluted in their sort of angst against Smith.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. So Henry Carey is the guy. Henry Carey's writing kind of in terms of neo-mercantilist thought from about the late 1840s on. He's an American. He has a lot of influence over the kind of Republican Party that emerges in the 1850s and their views towards the need for protectionism. And Carey, as you correctly point out, is a big fan of Adam Smith. Like he says very few negative things about Smith, and he, you know, like Adam Smith is a free trader, but Adam Smith has some exceptions where he said, no, there are some circumstances in which you should have protectionist policies, especially to defend national security. Like Smith has a famous line where he says, defense is of more importance than opulence. And Carey picks on those lines. You know, the lines where Smith is saying, here's some exceptions, and blows them into, you know, so we can be a fan of Adam Smith, but also be a fan of protectionist policies to pursue the wealth and power of the state. So whereas, as you point out, List, who's writing his book in 1841, and he's German, is much more polemical in taking on the Smith tradition, and consequently, you know, Smith is or List is the better known today of the neo-mercantilists. Like if you pick up a textbook in the field of international political economy, you tend to see List as the representative of the neo-mercantilist school. And I think it's for the reason you pointed out, that he was the polemicist in a way, attacking Smith, and so people really go to him for that reason.
Yeah. There's a quickness that one can absorb List and kind of stay excited through the text. I think I read something that he often wrote sort of all at once, like in sort of a multi-week period. So you can kind of feel that briskness, or like, you know, that kind of stream of consciousness to some degree with List, more so than you pick up Carey's text, and it's a little more turgid. There's definitely a lot of thought and effort that goes into every passage of it. So I think, I mean, ultimately that there's probably other reasons, but I think a big reason why List becomes this avatar of the neo-mercantilist movement is because he's just easier to read. He can get the points across to people, you know, 50 years down the road. Whereas it's hard to tell people, okay, go pick up you know, the principles of social science and, you know, which volume, and go deep into it.
Yeah, I mean, Carey's book is a hard read, right? Like, I mean,
yeah.
it took me days to read, and at the end, I kind of thought, wow, like, couldn't he have said that more succinctly? And there was a more succinct version of his book, which was put out by Kate McKean. And actually, that's the version I think most people read in the late 19th century. But even that's a bit of a tough read. And Joseph Schumpeter, who, you know, is this great historian of economic thought, has this fascinating line in his History of Economic Thought where he's talking about Carey, and he says, you know, it's a real puzzle why someone didn't popularize Carey with, you know, a more easy to read version, because, you know, Adam Smith was popularized very effectively in the 19th century by people like Jean-Baptiste Say, or, you know, they just wrote very easy to read versions of the wealth of nations argument, and nobody really did that with Carey. And I think that was, you know, that's why Carey, one of the reasons why Carey is less well known.
Yeah, and it's even more curious because in his life, he's the heir to this publishing empire in America at the time, the Carey Publishing House, which his father, also a similar-minded economist, started. So he has this huge ability to influence thought with this publishing company. He's very connected to the elites of America. His father was very connected to the founding fathers, very connected to the Philadelphia scene. Henry Charles Carey grows up in that, becomes very connected to sort of the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania industrialists. You know, as time goes on, certain segments, factions within America develop. You could say there's sort of the coastal traders and bankers. There's more of these sort of industrials that are emerging kind of close to the interior to some degree as they expand out. There's, of course, the sort of cash crop economy of the South. And so Carey kind of grows up in this, is very influential with these people, is very influential on shaping rhetoric in the Republican Party of that time, shaping a lot of the economic thinking of Abraham Lincoln at the time and the Republican Party after Abraham Lincoln. So it's curious why this figure that has such a impact in his living life that he kind of fades out as time goes on.
Yeah, and if I can just add too, I mean, he has enormous global influence. So, I mean, this is also true of List. List is read around the world, but Carey is read just as much around the world. So, for example, in Meiji Japan, and after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, and Japan is often depicted as this famous case of a country that adopted neo-mercantilist ideas, state subsidy for industry, very successful in promoting state-led industrial growth. And often people talk about how List had some influence on that Japanese thought, but actually Carey was the earlier figure that they read. And this is also true in other places, like in my country where I live in Canada. Carey has enormous influence. He has enormous influence, in fact, in Germany itself. This, I have to say, this really surprised me doing the research, is that Bismarck's famous 1879 tariff was more influenced by Carey, I thought, than the native German Listian thought. And so, and I also have an example in the book, which, this lasts. So even into the early 20th century, like there's the most important Ethiopian political economist is a Carey fan, and so Carey, I totally agree with you about his influence in the United States, and it's also true globally. Like he's just a major figure, and yet my training, like when I was trained in the history of thought of kind of 19th century protectionists, I learned very little about Carey. So I just think he deserves more attention. He's also, I don't know if I can just add here quickly,
Sure.
he's also interesting because his ideas are different than List. Like there are different kinds of neo-mercantilists. And so there's Carey is a really different version of neo-mercantilism. And so sometimes say, people who attack neo-mercantilists say, oh, look at all these mistakes List made, but often Carey didn't make those mistakes. He made other ones, but it's a really different kind of strand of thought.
Yeah, exactly. We could definitely talk more about sort of the global connections here, but on that remark about List, you can obviously see within List where he'll have interesting comments to make and insights to provide. He's a temperate zone chauvinist, as I think is a good descriptor. He's very dubious on criteria that allows a nation state to exist in terms of the size and other criteria, resources, things like that. And so, and he ultimately has a utopian end state of free trade, which cuts against, it's sort of an anticlimactic ending once you kind of read all his material, and then you realize he's just saying, oh, you do this for a short period of time or so, and then you become a world of free trading nations. So there's a lot of things like that within List that seem to just come together in an awkward fashion. Whereas, as you said, you read Carey, and there's much more of a coherent and sort of different set of policies. Carey is always remarking on the struggles of Ireland, especially, but also India, a lot of other colonial territories at the time. He's always making critiques of imperialism. He's talking about, I think, a lot of elite versus the common people divide. He's talking about that in America. He talks about it within England itself. And can you remark a little bit on that dichotomy that we see emerge within neo-mercantilism, where, is it actually imperialist? Is it anti-imperialist? Is it both, depending on who you're reading?
Yeah, so everything you've said, I think is really important. So on that last question about imperialism, it's a complicated question in a way, because so someone like List, and certainly true of Carey and almost all neo-mercantilists are outside of Britain, their enemy is the British free trading movement, which they see as a new form of empire. And so in that sense, they're anti-imperialist, but at the same time, some of them say, in order to challenge British power, we need our own empire. And so that's List's position. So List is an anti-imperialist when it comes to talking about British power over Germany or France or the United States at the time, but he's a pro-imperialist in terms of what those countries should do. So he thinks Germany should have its own empire. And as you point out, he has some views that very few other neo-mercantilists have in that period, where he says there are just certain parts of the world that should never industrialize. And that's what he calls the tropical or torrid zone countries. He uses that phrase sometimes. It's a kind of a climactic theory of political economy, where the temperate regions of the world can industrialize, although even there, he thinks some of them shouldn't. They have to have a big population and they have to be what he calls civilized. And but there are others, as you point out, like Carey is pretty consistently anti-imperialist. Like he hates the British Empire, but he also doesn't think America should become its own empire. And he's actually critical. He's critical of American policy towards Mexico, and even towards the indigenous peoples of North America. And so he's a bit more consistent on that. And it's also true, like one of the major figures I talk about in East Asia is Sun Yat-sen, who is he was the first provisional president of the Republic of China in 1911, revolutionary figure. But he also wrote a lot about political economy, and he's very interested in neo-mercantilist ideas. And he's another figure who's, he's an anti-imperialist, as many Chinese nationalists were at that time. And he's saying, as China becomes more powerful, they shouldn't reproduce the imperialism of the West. They should have their own way, of cultivating allies. And so again, it's a kind of a anti-imperialist form of neo-mercantilism. But having said that, like there are lots of neo-mercantilists like List who are very pro-imperialism because they think it's part of building the state, the power and wealth of their own state.
Yeah, and to take a quick sojourn with Sun Yat-sen and how you remarked earlier, why does one need to know about neo-mercantilism and the history of it for today and the forces that shape our world? One could argue that the ideology of a anti-imperialist neo-mercantilism of Sun Yat-sen is really important to understanding how China today operates in the world.
Yeah, I think it's a controversial topic, obviously, because China's rise right now in the world is perceived by some as a new form of imperialism, and certainly the Belt and Road Project is perceived that way by its critics. But you're right to say the Chinese leadership portrays it as a kind of a new form of international economic cohesion, which isn't like the Western colonial experience. What I found interesting is in the history of Chinese thought, you can find the two different positions. So the time that Sun Yat-sen is writing, and by the way, I should emphasize that Sun Yat-sen is cited by the Chinese leadership today. So Xi Jinping, has cited Sun Yat-sen's economic work as a kind of inspiration for the Chinese Communist Party, which is in some ways odd because Sun Yat-sen was not a communist. Given he's the one figure in Chinese intellectual history who both the nationalists and the communists can agree is okay, but anyway, they use Sun Yat-sen for propaganda reasons, I think. But at the same time that Sun Yat-sen was writing, Sun Yat-sen's major intellectual rival was Liang Qixiao, who was a pro-imperialist. Like he's writing at the turn of the century, and he's got same ideas. He's interested in neo-mercantilism and everything. But he has this famous line where he's saying, China should become the greatest imperialist power in the world, And so this tension, which I think we see today in people's interpretation and probably in the Chinese leadership itself, was there, a century ago when, in a way, China was at the lowest point of its power in world politics. But there were Chinese thinkers thinking, how do we get back, how do we get power and wealth again? And even at that point, it's really striking to see these thinkers, at the point where China is being conquered and it's just terrible position. They're saying, one day we will, one way we will be powerful again. And what should we do? And Liang Qixiao is saying, become imperialist. Yeah. And Sun Yat-sen saying, no, we've seen what it's like to be subject to imperialism, so we shouldn't do that when we become powerful again.
Yeah. And not so much that there's a direct line from from Sun Yat-sen and sort of whether it's the thoughts of anti-imperialism or this or that. But I think sort of the common parlance is to connect the current Chinese ruling doctrine to Mao, and then you go back to Marxism, and then you're in, it's sort of, you have this detour, and there's very little study going back to this figure of Sun Yat-sen as an opening to then look at other neo-mercantilist thinkers in China, and as you do wonderfully, kind of go back to deeper origins of these ideas that evolve independently of any sort of Western export into China.
Yeah, and I really, I mean, I'm trying to convince my students of this right now. Like, China is the major rising power. We need to understand the intellectual traditions better than our textbooks have done. And in this case, particularly important, I mean, China pursues neo-mercantilist policies, subsidies, strategic protectionism, all these things. And they are drawing, at least in part, we can debate how much, but at least in part, on this deep intellectual tradition from the 19th and even earlier, which was kind of developmentalist thinking. And, if you look in a textbook on political economy, you won't find any mention of a figure like Zheng Guanyin, who was like a major figure in the 1870s and 80s in convincing Chinese intellectuals that China needs to industrialize with state-led policies. And I just think, from an intellectual standpoint, we need to understand these thinkers because they are cited by both Chinese scholars, but also sometimes by Chinese policymakers in the current period.
Yeah, and this might be a hard question to answer, but when is the idea of intellectual diffusionism correct, and when is it wrong? And that there is, of course, areas of, convergent evolution on similar ideas.
Yeah, great question, but also super tough to answer.
Yeah.
So I try to balance this line in the book where I'm saying there is a lot of diffusion. So it's kind of fascinating because you think of, there's lots written about the diffusion of free trade thought, and liberals themselves are interested in promoting their ideas because they had a cosmopolitan vision, right? If everyone could become free trade, it would be a more peaceful world. So they have an interest in promoting a free trade, and so did Marxists, right? Like, they're trying to promote a global revolution, so they have an interest in promoting their ideas. But neo-mercantilists, is very little written about the diffusion of neo-mercantilist thought, and yet it was pretty extensive. And it was different. It wasn't like a push, like the British liberals were pushing their ideas around the world, or Soviet Marxists were pushing their ideas. Neo-mercantilists, not so much. Like, they're concerned with their own state. So why would they, encourage another state to become wealthy and powerful? It's more of a demand side pull where people, read Carey and they're like, wow, he's describing the oppression that America is experiencing by British free trade being imposed. And they're like, that's the situation we're in too. And so there's a resonance. And so there's a lot of diffusion of that kind of demand, importing the ideas that seem relevant to the context that they find themselves in. But at the same time, and so that's the diffusion story. But at the same time, there are these local traditions of what I call mercantilist thought, like pre-Smithian advocacy of developmental statism, if you like, which they can draw on. So I think it's no coincidence that the region of the world that is most receptive to List and Carey and these other Western neo-mercantilists is East Asia, which had its own endogenous traditions. So I mentioned the Chinese one, but there are other ones. Korea had its own endogenous tradition, and especially important was the Japanese one. So some people say, oh, how amazing it was, the Meiji leadership after 1868, out of nowhere, seemingly, import these ideas from the West and produce this incredibly successful state of industrialization. But that view is just completely incorrect. Like, they had a 200-year that's overstating it, from about the 1720s or so onwards, an endogenous tradition of, what we can call mercantilist thought. And historians of Japanese economic thought call it that, and they call it mercantilist thought. And it was, interestingly, this is the time when Japan is sealed off from the world largely. And so it's not like Japan's competing with China or Korea. It's inside the country. There were all these little subnational jurisdictions that are competing with each other, and they're political economy thinkers who begin to think, oh, how can my little jurisdiction compete with the next door neighbor one? And that's the context in which a kind of mercantilist thought emerges. And then when Admiral Perry comes through with the ships and opens Japan in the 1850s, those thinkers, there's a rich tradition of how you promote economic growth through state activism, but at the subnational level, all they do is they transfer that to the national level, and they say Japan as a whole, can now and buy these deals. And look, here's List and Carey saying the same thing. And so it's this mix of the Western thought, but also their own endogenous tradition.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the strongest points of your work, of fully realizing the sort of global history of all of these movements, of how there's endogenous inputs to them, how there is importations from other countries, and they're shaping each other in real time. So it's not really a story of, oh, well, it goes from country X to Y to Z, but it's this, convulsing type of intellectual discovery process.
I totally agree.
Yeah, and so then on the subject of looking at global connections and seeing how things can emerge in one country and kind of shift to the other and then, recreate itself. I think one of the interesting aspects of Henry Carey in America is the fact that he is a first-generation Irish American. His father was an immigrant from Ireland, very involved with a proto-neo-mercantilist, or at that time, I guess, mercantilist scene in Ireland, leading to the 1798 rebellion against England, where much of the gripe was with this idea of England prohibiting industrialization in Ireland and that weakening it. And so Matthew Carey emerges out of that context, comes to America, and actually becomes one of the main proponents himself of these types of ideas. And he's being influenced by this, ideology that he really doesn't evolve from as a young man coming out of his 20s into America. And he continually kind of matures that. And as he is this sort of correspondent with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, these early founding fathers of America, he's actually shaping what is to then become the American system that emerges sort of in the 1820s. Largely sort of attributed to Henry Clay, or a lot of people then sort of attributed to Alexander Hamilton and his sort of famous reports when he was Secretary of Treasury, that then goes on to evolve into this. But Matthew Carey, as this huge publisher, is keeping this line of thought going, is involved with still a lot of sort of Irish American institutions that are in Philadelphia. And then his son emerges in this context, understands himself sort of within that network, himself looks at Ireland, travels to Ireland, comments on the depravities going on. He lives through the famine of Ireland. And I think this is shaping his worldview quite a bit, and is shaping what eventually turns into his variant of neo-mercantilism. So can you please comment on the Irish influence, perhaps, of Carey?
Yeah, I can. But as we were talking just before we began the recording, I think you know more than I do about this, and I'm fascinated to hear some of the things that you've discovered about that. The story I tell is a fairly limited story, but I've certainly had the sense there was more to say about this, and I think you found some of these important aspects. So the story I tell is one, as you say, that the Henry Carey, the better known, his father comes from Ireland, I think at age 24 or something, like he's pretty young. But yeah, as you say, he becomes a major figure in the early American neo-mercantilist movement. There's a funny part to the story, though, that Henry Carey, his son, is a free trader for the early part of his life. So his father, major figure, and his son is writing political economy in 1830s, and is an embarrassment to his father because his work is free trading. And it's not until the mid 1840s or so that Henry, the son, converts back to his father's cause. And interestingly, the arguments that Henry develops that are the most famous ones are so similar to his fathers. Like all the points that you're raising are, we can find them in the father, in Matthew Carey's writing, and some of them are really interesting because, as you say, like Matthew Carey is popularizing Alexander Hamilton's famous report on manufacturers from 1790, early 1790s. But Hamilton, didn't have a kind of a populist sense at all. Like it's a kind of elitist sense of how you're going to promote American industrialization. Whereas Matthew Carey, like it's a much more populist thing, like we should be supporting small industrialists, and he's got this what I call social mercantilist vision. Like it's kind of, we're not doing it just for the state and power, or the power and wealth of the state. We're also trying to help distributional issues within the country. So Matthew Carey writes about the plight of working women in factories, and how we need to address this inequality, and that's not really in Hamilton. Hamilton, when he mentions women, he's interested in how they could be employed more efficiently if industry was developed in America. In other words, a kind of instrumental use of gender to promote American industrialization. Whereas Matthew Carey seems genuinely interested in the cause of greater gender inequality, and his son Henry takes that on. So, like Henry's vision of neo-mercantilism is so different than List that way. List, and by the way, this is really important because List is criticized by Marxists throughout the 19th century for, where's the social justice here? All you're talking about is the power and wealth of a state. Well, there was a social justice message in this other strand of neo-mercantilism, Carey's strand. And so Marx himself, for example, is kind of interested in Carey's ideas. He's critical of them, but he's interested. Whereas Marx, in fact, List's 1841 book was one of the first works that Marx read of political economy, and Marx was very critical of it. I think it's one of the reasons Marx becomes interested in political economy is he reads List and he reacts against it, because it doesn't have a kind of a class story, But he reads Carey a little bit later, and he's kind of intrigued by Carey because Carey does have a kind of a story about exploitation. That he talks about the traders who are exploiting the farmers and exploiting the workers, and it's a very different vision than List.
Yeah,
and that comes from Matthew.
Yeah, and I believe the famous quote by Marx was, Carey is the most original economist of the North Americans. So there's this fascination by Marx with him, and I think it's on this issue of Carey is talking about class and sort of the hierarchy of elites versus the common folk. And I think that going back to Hamilton, you can kind of see this divide emerge. Where Hamilton's sort of this like monopolist industrialist. In some ways, he's almost like a cartoon villain. Maybe I'm being too uncharitable with that, but of like sort of what you would think of as an industrialist that's sort of looking out for himself. He sort of has a hand in this New Jersey company, which he wants to be this sort of huge manufacturing powerhouse that gets subsidies from the government. And like that is his kind of ideal version of neo-mercantilism. Whereas the Careys, Matthew to his son, are kind of more talking about this idea of the tariff, which Hamilton wasn't so hot on. And why they like the tariff is because they say it's this broad-based policy tool where the big and the small manufacturer in America are on the same playing field. And so you can actually raise all boats by instituting a tariff rather than these sort of very specific subsidies that will just sort of aid monopolists.
Yeah, I think that's important about Hamilton's caution on protectionism, because he's often cited today, as a figure who's very pro-protectionism. But as you point out, he's very cautious about it. Only very certain limited circumstances, it might be better to use subsidies. Whereas, as you point out, the Careys have very few restrictions. Like we want a tariff, and it's not even, in certain circumstances you should do it. It's sort of a tariff in general is good. And that's a much stronger endorsement of trade protectionism than was true of the Hamilton version.
Yeah, and to remark on Matthew Carey and his relationship with Hamilton, what's interesting is that Hamilton, the evidence for Hamilton being the forefather of industrialization or the American variant is his reports as Secretary of Treasury. But as you look into it, you actually see that there's evidence that a lot of the thought of the reports, of course, Hamilton contributed, but was done by his assistant, this gentleman by the name of Cox. And Cox was writing in Matthew Carey's magazine, The American Museum, during that time, and they were circulating ideas between each other. And so there's an interesting line of thought that suggests pre-existing from Hamilton's reports, you have this circulation of ideas with Matthew Carey as this Philadelphia sort of intellectual socialite, and sort of going back and forth with Cox sort of then contributing a lot to the development of these reports that Hamilton signs his name to. Then where you find actually that there's problems with Hamilton is sort of in these points of deviation. And then as, you know, Hamilton becomes kind of like an unpopular figure. He kind of gets chewed out of the Federalists, and sort of, you know, obviously he dies early on. And so you have this situation where Hamilton kind of loses popularity. He dies. There's sort of no one left to sort of talk about Hamilton. I found like a Google Ngram of Hamilton and works from that era too. And Hamilton doesn't become popular again until his son writes a biography of him in the 1830s. So it's interesting that you're sort of looking at this period, and there's this problem where why is Hamilton considered this way when it's sort of there's not a lot of momentum pushing him in that direction during his time and then sort of immediately after. But you see that Matthew Carey is sort of carrying the legacy of Hamilton throughout this. And he's almost sort of cherry picking Hamilton to some degree, always using Hamilton sort of in prefaces of his works to talk about how great the Hamilton system is. In the 1820s to 30s, he goes on, my count is somewhere around 30. He anonymously writes under the pen name Hamilton 30 times in different publications. And so there's this weird adulation that Matthew Carey is giving Hamilton. And I think, and I have to kind of crystallize this theory a little bit more, but I think there is almost like a psychiatric analysis you need to do of Matthew Carey as an immigrant, feeling as an outsider, like he can't stand on his own 2 feet to promote these ideas. He's also a very short man. He has a bum leg. He was made fun of as a child. I think there was a lot of insecurity surrounding Matthew Carey of why he couldn't stand to promote these ideas. And he saw Hamilton as this great avatar that he had to, like I said, he had to don the name of Hamilton in the 20s to 30s to promote these ideas. So, I mean, that's a pet theory I have, but it's this interesting case to kind of follow the train of thought of Matthew Carey kind of being this backbone, carrying it all the way through, and then eventually arriving at Henry Carey. And this is where it all connects, where the point at which Henry Carey kind of transforms from a free trader to a neo-mercantilist. There's a quote by Henry where he says something to the degree of like, one night I woke up in a cold sweat and I instantly converted. I saw the light. But when you look at sort of that period, I think it's between like 1838 to like 1848, let's say. I think that's like the transformation period. If there was a night, I'm not sure exactly what the night was, but the critical things that happen in this period, his father dies, so major life-changing event, and the Irish famine goes on. And so 2 big Irish connections in his life sort of happen and start to change his thought process. And so like in a book like Past, Present, and Future that Carey wrote, he talks about all of these sort of anti-imperialist concepts happening in Ireland. And so this is where I think it's fundamental to recognize what is it about this Irish perspective and drawing on sources from Ireland that then shapes how the Careys think about economics and neo-mercantilism, then how that actually shapes this idea of the American system of economics that we think then sort of is produced and what people wrongly say diffuses throughout the world. It all starts with Alexander Hamilton. So,
Yeah.
So with that mouthful, please respond.
No, it's very interesting. I would like to see, this is just my own personal interest, I would love to see more work on kind of the Irish political economy thought before the kind of 1770s or so, and to see, you know, And there's a little bit of writing that I could find on this, and there is a kind of Irish mercantilist tradition, I think, as there are in many European countries in that period. And from what I could understand of it, but I'm not by any means an expert, it also had this kind of social dimension to it. And so that it's, that's really fascinating if the story that you're telling, can be borne out with people doing more research on this early Irish tradition, showing that it was a little bit distinctive. And then, as you say, the Matthew then brings that to the United States and merges it with the Hamilton thing. I think the other interesting thing you were saying about Hamilton's influence is like Henry Carey also cites Hamilton often. And so it carries on the tradition you're describing that Matthew was doing. But it's also true of Liszt, like Liszt. And again, Liszt is an immigrant to the United States. He moves to the United States in the mid 1920s and lives there for 5 or 6 years, if I remember correctly. And he's also invoking Hamilton. So that resonates with your idea that the immigrants go to this figure, to justify their own defense of protections. But Liszt, like Matthew Carey, is bringing protectionist ideas from continental Europe, which he had already developed.
Yeah.
And then he arrives in the United States in the mid 1920s and finds this rich tradition of which Matthew Carey is one, and he says, "Great, So it's not just German states, but also France, where he had also lived, and the United States. We can all, we all have the same view. We all hate the British Free Trade Empire, and so yeah, it's an interesting coalition." Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's fascinating of where does Liszt end, of all places in America, where does Liszt end up? Philadelphia. And who is he interacting with? The same societies that Carey, who's an elder man now at this point, is running. Right. And in the text, the first text that Liszt produces about America, talking about the American economic situation. And he is referencing, he's saying, he's basically citing sort of the Carey-inspired publications and directly works written by Carey in the prefaces of his work on America as sort of his source. And, I don't think there is a, Liszt is being filled up as sort of an empty vessel here in any way. Right. But I do think the relationship that Liszt as a younger man coming to America, Carey as the elder and sort of the host of this Philadelphia intellectual society group, I think that is an important facet of understanding then, how does Liszt then become associated with giving Hamilton this credit as this forefather? And that's where I think Matthew Carey comes back in as this critical marketer of Hamilton for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's I find that really interesting. I think it's also interesting that when Liszt is in the United States and writing, as you say, he writes this important set of letters really in 1827. And it's kind of his first exposition of what becomes the more famous 1841 book. And I found I was really interested in comparing the content of the book, content of those letters to the later book. And one thing that shifts is List's endorsement of imperialism. And so in the 1827, he's got a more defensive, I call it, form of neo-mercantilism, and in fact praises the American political economy for being, anti-imperialist, which is the Carey tradition. But then he goes back to Europe and lives a bit in France and gets very interested in the French imperialism in North Africa and seems to like it. And so he then embraces a more pro-imperialist European style. So it's interesting, these different influences.
Yeah. And so that's where you see the country of origin or stopover shapes these ideas. And that's where it's okay, what is special going back to Ireland that would then create the variant of the Careys? Obviously this history and legacy of colonialism in Ireland, whether we want to or we can quibble about it being the first sort of colony in this sort of style of imperialism, and thinkers within Ireland, some crudely, some more maturely addressing this issue of how does this economic system work vis-a-vis England versus Ireland? What is being done to Ireland that is sort of artificial? Is there a history that one could look at that shows Ireland was actually advancing past England in some capacities, and then these artificial prohibitions were put on, and it then degraded. And so I think that's where there's this swirl of ideas that is occurring. You know, I think you could say from the 1600s, 1700s, especially then going into the 1800s. I think by the 1800s, we could say something to the degree of there's an Irish school of neo-mercantilist thought. The same way that neo-mercantilism gets thrown into, okay, there's an American school, maybe the German historical school. I think there's somewhat of an under-discussed Irish school. And I think it very much is the school of anti-imperialism, of being the recipients of that imperialism, and having to write about it not within a brief window of sort of, you know, national consciousness awakening and then immediate sort of revolution and then state formation. It was this long period of being colonized and having to advance these ideas under that way. They couldn't be like the Germans and say like, okay, maybe we're sort of getting the negative side effect of the English free trade system, but you know, we can flip that on a switch and become imperialist ourselves. The Irish didn't really have that cop out or whatever off ramp to say now they're going to be imperialists themselves.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, and I hope you write more about that, because I think it's an important argument. And the only thing I add to that is that there are people in other parts of the world, other colonized parts of the world, like the Indian political economists in the 19th century, who are also developing neo-mercantilist ideas, who are very interested in Ireland's experience. So Ireland is a kind of a case that a lot of people are using around the world. So it's not just Irish thinkers, but also Ireland's experience that's being invoked by people around the world.
Yeah, yeah. So I know we're running up against the clock a little bit, so I wanted to focus on perhaps two more questions. So I wanted to get to the idea of what were Carey's views on money and banking, and were they radical? And especially in the context, I think, when we talk about neo-mercantilism, and then when we talk about Carey, we go to his main policy was the tariff, or the main policy of the neo-mercantilists is the tariff. But what is it about money and banking talked about by Carey that is interesting?
Right. So he is one of the thinkers who endorses the greenback movement during the American Civil War and after. And so that's, you know, it's a movement that's basically rejecting the gold standard, or rejecting a connection of a currency to any metallic standard, and endorsing what we would call today a floating exchange rate. And it's partly linked to the protectionist thing, you know, that he thinks that would provide some protection for American industrialists, but it's also, I think, a sense that money should not be constrained by a tie to a metallic standard. It needs to be, you know, elastic and able to respond to the needs of expanding industry. And so you're needing a kind of a conception of monetary autonomy, which the gold standard obviously doesn't provide you with. And I think he's also got this idea that the gold standard is giving Britain power. You know, like America is getting affected by British financial crises via the tie to the gold standard. And so it's that, again, a kind of a sense of autonomy, not just monetarily, but even financially. And that is true of a number of neo-mercantilists, that they combine protectionism with a call for inconvertible currencies. And I wouldn't describe Carey as a pioneer in that element of neo-mercantilism. I think there are others who developed the ideas earlier, including one in Canada who is influencing some of the, who reads Carey, but actually has developed the monetary ideas a little bit earlier. The other side I should mention too of Carey is that he seems to be a free banking advocate. Like, he doesn't believe in monopoly central banks, you know, monopoly note issued by a central bank. And he, you know, cites the Scottish example of free banking. And so again, that's part of his, I guess we haven't talked about that, but it's part of his vision that the political economy should be decentralized. So you're putting up a tariff, but he doesn't want to have the tariff in order to have great monopolies being created. He wants a decentralized economic life. And part of that decentralism is, you know, small scale banking and not a monopoly by a single central bank.
And then what was his relationship to the first and second national banks of the United States, and also maybe his father too, because he's influential in this period as well?
Yeah, I'm less familiar with that. Maybe you know more about that. Do you know what Matthew Carey's views were on that?
So generally, and of course, Henry might have a little bit more of an evolving view depending on which time period you're talking about. But generally, both of them were supporters of the First and Second National Bank. And so this is where it's interesting because they were advocates of decentralized banking. And Henry talks about, the Scottish model, for example, as something I think he wants to emulate. But they had this conception of the national bank as something that was a regulatory apparatus. And I think what they saw was if you leave things as they are, you won't have a decentralized banking network in the private sector. What you'll have there are these starved peripheral banks in the places where money is most needed. So you have all these sort of Western areas that are needing money that don't have money. Then you have New York City and Boston that are just dominating all the capital markets. And so what he saw was if you just leave things alone, they will starve everyone else out and they'll just be these monopolies. But he saw a way in which the national bank could be used to sort of offset that sort of private monopolization effect. And you could kind of regulate it. He talked about ways of also, distributing credit from the national bank. So the national bank could extend credit to the Western territories, or constrict credit when Boston and New York were just like going rampant with giving more loans out and creating bubbles. Carey was very conscious of bubble formation in the economy, and so I see a lot of his views on money and banking as something that are to some degree anachronistic. He was almost sometimes like too early for his time, and where it's like we see a lot of the analysis of sort of like financial bubbles in the way that he talks about them. They seem almost more modern, that we're more familiar with today than the 19th century.
That seems the views you're describing sound completely consistent with his trade views. You're essentially stopping the British monopoly with a tariff, but not in order to create domestic. He wants free trade domestically. So it's similar. Sounds like.
Yeah, he was very, and that goes back to the populist angle and the sort of elite first common, where he saw sort of the Western settlers, and also as Reconstruction went on, he saw the South also as these capital-starved areas, where he said, "Look, we need to industrialize all these areas." And the problem is we just have this artificial limit on the credit we're extending and the money in circulation there. And so to move on quickly, to kind of give us into a conversation with other thinkers that have sort of commented on sort of neo-mercantilism. There's the development economist ha-joon and Eric S. Reinhardt, who've argued that lessons from neo-mercantilist school of thought offer objectively successful policies that all nations have used to develop. So what do you think of their conclusion on that and their portrayal of the intellectual history of neo-mercantilism?
Right. So those thinkers, and there's some other ones too, have done, I think, a really important job in highlighting this tradition. And all I'm really coming along and saying is and this isn't true of necessarily those two writers, but ha-joon, for example, does promote List's idea in the title of one of his famous books, Kicking Away the Ladder, suggesting that List is a central figure. And I'm saying, yeah, List is a really key figure, but he's not the only one. There were lots of others. And to recognize the diversity within this tradition is really one of my goals. And part of that is also to emphasize or try to encourage people to see that this tradition came not just out of a European or Western. Like we've ended up talking quite a bit about the Careys and List, and they are no doubt very important. But there are also these other traditions that I think people today really need to understand. Like if you want to understand India as a rising power, like I'm a teacher of political economy. I need my students not just to know about List and Carey. They need to understand Indian neo-mercantilists in the 19th century because they're being cited, or similarly with the Chinese ones we talked about or the Japanese ones. And so some writers who have written about this history of neo-mercantilist thought, I think have focused just on the Western thinkers, and then suggested this diffusion story to the rest of the world. And I'm saying, yeah, lots of diffusion, no question about it. You're right, but let's also recognize the endogenous traditions that were there, because they often were quite distinctive, and they helped explain, why Chinese political economy is the way it is. It's different in some aspects.
Great, great. Well, with that being said, is there a final insight you'd like people to take away from your work? And is there any future works or areas you want to point people to?
The message of the book in the most macro sense is the history of economic thought is really interesting. Like we think the problems we encounter in our own era are unique, and that we have all these thinkers who are suddenly inventing things. But the more you read the history of economic thought, as I'm sure you would agree, because you've done a lot of it, the more you see that these problems have been thought about in the past. And we can learn a lot, I think, by reading what past people thought about it, but also because those people are often influential on thinkers today. And so we need to understand these kind of lineages of thought. So that'd be the one thing I'd say. And the other thing about future work, is just to say that if people are interested in the history of economic thought in the pre-1945 period about the world economy, beyond just neo-mercantilist thinkers, I have this book coming out in April, which is trying to provide a bit of a survey of that, and also in a global way. So Chinese thinkers, Japanese thinkers, Latin American thinkers, African thinkers, and to show that, in fact, the debate was even wider than just Marxism, liberalism, neo-mercantilism. There was also a long tradition of environmentalist thought going back to the late 18th century, environmentalism and the world economy. Long tradition of feminist thought, lots of thought about the way religion intersected with political economy in the context of debates about the world economy. So there are all kinds of traditions. So that's what I'm trying to do in this new book, just to say many things we're debating today. Suddenly, environmentalism, how are we going to, that's been thought about also by people for, a long period of time.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Your work was tremendous. I think it is a must-have on any university syllabus dealing with these subject matters. Very personally edifying for myself, very interested in these subjects, to sort of see you go through not just Carey in America, but then expand into all of these global examples and case studies. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate the interest. When you write a book over a long number of years, you just hope people will find it interesting. So I'm delighted to hear that you found it interesting.